From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
I think it's safe to say that even non-true crime junkies have likely heard the following names before: Jack the Ripper, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Zodiac Killer, and so on. All famous serial killers from various periods in history. But how about the Blackout Ripper? Few would likely be familiar with this particular killer. But what if I told you that back during the height of World War II, there was a killer roaming the streets of London, a phantom, stalking his victims amidst the nightly air raid sirens and bomb shelters and rubble? This week, I welcome my guest, author and researcher Simon Reed, to talk all about his book, The Blackout Murders, the shocking true story about the Blackout Ripper. Welcome to this week's mystery, part one of The Blackout Ripper on From the Void. All right, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited this week to have author Simon Reed with me. Thanks for spending some time with me today.
John, great to be here. Thanks.
Well, you wrote a book on a topic that is very interesting to me because, like we were talking about before we started recording, I was completely unfamiliar with this case until I happened upon it in a documentary. How did you first become aware of this?
I actually stumbled across the story completely by accident. So I've always been fascinated by World War II, and particularly World War II London, with the blackout and the bombings and all that. And I received one year as a gift a history of crime in wartime London. And I was reading this thing, and it was a one-sentence mention. I mean, it just said, there was a chapter, and it was dealing with murders and how hard they were to investigate in the city during the war. And there was one sentence where it talked about Scotland Yard pursuing a serial killer called the Blackout Ripper. And it just said basically that he killed several women in the course of a week, and then he was captured because he made a mistake at a crime scene. That's all it said. But the name Blackout Ripper just really grabbed my attention. I was like, Blackout Ripper, what the hell is that? That sounds like really ominous and cool. And this was about 20 years ago or so. And so I went online and I dug around, and I found, sure enough, some resources about this killer who he killed 4 women in the course of a week. He moved very quickly. And his crimes were sort of like Jack the Ripper, which is why he got the nickname the Blackout Ripper. But because they happened during the war, when there was a lot of other stuff going on, they've never really received the media attention that they probably deserved. And so I realized that there was possibly a story here, not only a story about Scotland Yard's hunt for a serial killer, but also a story about sort of a murder investigation in wartime under very unique circumstances. And that's kind of how the book came about.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, as you said, there's this backdrop of war happening, and specifically in London at the time, London is just being bombed into rubble. So for listeners, kind of set the stage, like what was life like in London at that point in time?
Sure. Well, you sort of nailed it. London is very much a city on the front line. Its landscapes has been forever altered by German high explosives and incendiaries. If you were to walk through the city parks back in the time, you'd see air raid trenches crisscrossing the grounds. You'd see anti-aircraft batteries set up. The city's statues have been hidden underneath concrete slabs to prevent bomb damage. Government buildings are surrounded in barbed wire and sandbags. Streets have been blocked off to prevent advancement in the event of a German landing. So the city is very much a war zone. There's rationing going on, not just of food products, but also materials like silk. So silks, women's silk stockings are a hot commodity. So there's a big thriving black market. This, of course, gives rise to sort of crime, theft, and that sort of thing. And more importantly to this story is there's a blackout. Every night when the sun sets, the city goes into sort of a dark oblivion. No lights are allowed, and obviously this is to thwart German bombers. And this gives rise to a whole other kind of life. There's a flourishing sort of sex scene in London at night. Prostitution is big business, because this is a city, like I say, it's on the front line. You have thousands of military men coming in and out of the city every day. So there's a thriving business here. And, a lot of women, their husbands go off to war. So some women go to work in the factories. Other women have to make a living, in other methods. And so prostitution is one thing they turn to. And I should also say, this is a city, too, with a depleted police force, right? Because a lot of the men in Metropolitan Police, they've been called off to war. So Scotland Yard is operating with fewer numbers than normal. And they're also operating under an order of radio silence. They can't use radios to communicate because that can be picked up by German bombers. So it's this unique set of circumstances which kind of allows this killer to sort of thrive, if only for a week. But, yeah.
Yeah, it is sort of unique in that way, where it really, as you said, he's very prolific in the sense that this guy does not take a night off. Like he's out there prowling every single night for a week.
He doesn't, John. That's one of the things that really struck me when I started researching this. When I initially stumbled across the mention of the Blackout Ripper in the book, it said he was sort of active within a week, but it didn't really convey sort of the ferocity and the rapidity with which he struck. And when you say this guy didn't take a rest, you're absolutely right. He was out every single night doing his thing, and this baffled investigators. I mean, even when you read the police files, they're like, this guy is just like, he's all over the place, and that was really striking to investigators. And it also sort of adds to the mystery, which I'm sure we'll talk about, because prior to him committing these acts, there was nothing in his character to suggest that he had this bloodlust. And we'll talk about, I'm sure, the killer going forward. But he seemed to be overwhelmed out of nowhere with this need for blood or to kill or whatever you want to call it. And he acted on it, and he didn't stop until he was caught.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and I definitely want to dig into the psychology aspect of it. Before we do that, though, I think, to set the stage a little bit more, and just in terms of what life was like specifically for women, this is a very dangerous time, especially if you were a single woman during wartime. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it was a hard time for women. Obviously, this is a period when men are the primary breadwinners, right? And the women stay home and sort of raise the kids. And now the husbands have gone off to war, or gone off to partake in the war effort in some regard. And so women are left alone to fend for themselves. And so, like I said, some of them do go into the factories to sort of make ends meet. Obviously, women make up the primary workforce during wartime in the factories, turning out planes, tanks, munitions, whatnot. But a lot of them turn to the streets to make money. And prostitution in wartime London, it wasn't legal, but it was accepted. It was just considered a part of life, and it was obviously very dangerous. It put the women at great risk, because you're dealing with a clientele who come into the city on a transport train or a ship. They're there for a couple of days, and then maybe they commit a crime, and then they're off on a battlefield somewhere. They're not going to be captured. And so you've got this constantly evolving suspect pool. The other thing is they're operating in total darkness. They're operating at night. This is not a city with well-lit areas at nighttime. The whole city is like pitch black. And the way they'd attract business back in those days is they'd stand in a doorway or on a street corner, and they'd have little flashlights, and they'd shine the flashlights down at their ankles. And that was kind of an indication that they were available. And then if you were interested, you'd go up and you'd name their price. And American GIs, they used to have a quote. They'd go up to these London prostitutes. They'd ask for a price. The lady would give their price, and the Americans were prone to say, when they'd hear the price, if it was too expensive for them, they say, "Honey, I want to rent it, not buy it." And so you'd haggle, and then they'd go off, and some of the women had rooms they'd go to. Some of these women had like homes where they lived, and then they maintained rooms where they'd go to conduct business. So someone would take their customers back to a room to conduct business. Others would use air raid shelters. I mentioned sort of the air raid trenches dug through the parks. Those were a frequent place to conduct illicit business. But it obviously it was not safe. It was dangerous. And there were obviously incidents of women being assaulted and murdered.
Talk about the victims a little bit because, as you said, there is sort of that common thread amongst all of them where, and they really are a diverse group of women.
They are, and there are 4 murder victims. 3 of them are prostitutes. One of them isn't. The first one is Evelyn Hamilton. She has just arrived in the city. She's in the city for like 2 days or so before she's murdered. She's actually a chemist by trade. She graduated in 1938 from the University of Edinburgh with a degree in chemistry, and she'd worked in a number of chemists, or as we call them here in the States, pharmacies. But she was not a happy person. She didn't have a husband. She didn't have a family. She felt something was missing. She'd actually come down to London to try and sort of find some sort of meaningful life. She was a lonely individual. She was staying in a boarding house. She went out for dinner one night shortly after her arrival in the city, and then runs into this individual and is ended up found in an air raid shelter. The next victim is a young lady named Evelyn Oatley. She also went by the name Lita Ward. She is, when I was researching the book, I thought she was one of the saddest cases because she was married to a pig farmer in the town of Blackpool, but the rural life wasn't for her. She got married in 1936 and realized that being a farmer's wife isn't what she wanted. She always wanted to be an actress, a star of the stage. And so she come down to London to try and find stardom. That obviously didn't work out. War breaks out. She ends up as a topless dancer at a place called the Windmill Theatre in Soho, which was famous for its topless review. This in turn leads to her sort of working the streets, and she's very lonely. She actually she tells friends she's lonely. She tells her husband she's lonely. Her husband knows what she does for a living, and he remains loyal to her and says, "I love you. Please come back to Blackpool. Come back to the pig farm." She doesn't want to do that, and so she sort of turns to prostitution not only for money but also for sort of companionship in a weird way. And then it's just her misfortune that she runs into the Blackout Ripper and ends up the way she ends up. The next victim is... the next victim is...
Margaret Lowe.
Thank you. Yeah, the next... I was like, there's a lot of them. The next victim is Margaret Lowe. All these women, all their stories are tragic, by the way. When I say Evan Oatley struck me as the saddest, that's not to say I didn't find the others sad. They're all sad in their own way. Margaret Lowe is the next victim. She is a single mother. She has a 15-year-old daughter named Barbara. And she has tried to make ends meet in various ways. She ran a shop. She ran a boarding house. None of that worked out. She sends her daughter, Barbara, off to boarding school, and she turns to prostitution. She's a very regal lady. She's very upper class, wears very fancy dresses and coats. And she earns herself the nickname on the streets, the lady, because of her very... regal manner. She doesn't take gruff from anyone, and she brings men home to her apartment. She does have a history of being roughed up a couple of times. Neighbors tell the police that just recently she's been assaulted by a Canadian soldier, but that doesn't stop her from plying her trade. And she ends up bringing the Blackout Ripper home to her apartment. Obviously, he does his thing. She's not found for a couple of days. What actually happens is a delivery man leaves a package outside her door, and it stays there for a couple of days. And that's what alerts the neighbors to what's happened inside. The sad thing is the body's discovered when the daughter, Barbara, comes from boarding school to visit the mom. So that's a really tragic circumstance. And then the last victim, or the last murder victim, is a woman named Doris, and I'm going to probably butcher her last name, but it's pronounced Janot, I would say. I don't know if you have any ideas how you pronounce.
I was going to ask you. I was like,
I don't know. It's terrible when you write these things and then there's a name you don't know how to pronounce it and you have to say it out loud. But I think it's pronounced Janot. She is the wife of an elderly hotel manager, and he knows full well what she does for a living. She makes no secret of hiding it from him. And, he works during the nights. He comes home during the day. She prepares his dinner. He has it. He kisses her goodbye. He goes off to work, and she goes out onto the streets. He keeps hoping that maybe she'll find a different path, pursue a different career. But, she enjoys her work. And so she goes out one night and obviously brings the Ripper home and meets with fatal consequences there. So, all the women have their own stories. And that's one of the things, John, I'm glad you brought it up. When I was writing the book, sometimes when you read these serial killer books, the star, for lack of a better word, is the serial killer. With this book, I very much wanted to try and get as much information as I could on the victims because they are human. Their mothers, their wives, and they have stories to be told. And learning about them, it drives home the tragedy. These aren't faceless entities. These aren't bad people. They were women who ran into the wrong person at the wrong time, and I wanted to sort of get that across.
Yeah, and so many of them were literally in situations where they were just trying to survive. Like the one that comes to mind also is, I believe it was Doris you were just talking about, or I'm sorry, no, was it Margaret Lowe, the lady known as the lady?
Yeah.
Where she's trying to get her daughter through school and her daughter doesn't even know. And so she, I think they said every third weekend she would come home to visit.
She comes,
she would
exactly.
Life as,
and it's sad, and it shows you sort of the struggle these women were going through. And, they're no different than you and I. They got families they need to provide for them. They got children they're worried about, want to provide the best they can for. And they're doing what they can, under the circumstances. So it was a tough life. And, it's sad that things sort of turned out the way it did. But that was something I very much wanted to get across in the book, is that these women are, doing the best they can under incredibly trying circumstances, unfortunately, they suffered for it.
So let's get into talking about the killer himself. So it was ended up they find this guy who is just like so many serial killers, sort of a little bit of an ego there, but very charming. He's a good-looking guy. I saw pictures of him. I was like, okay,
he's handsome.
He's a handsome guy. His name is Gordon Cummins.
Yeah.
And as with a lot of serial killers, with that bit of the ego, overinflated ego, he also sort of like pumps up his sort of backstory in a way.
He does, yeah. Gordon Frederick Cummins. He's 28, and these killings, by the way, just for your listeners, they take place in a 1 week span in February 1942. So he's 28 years old at the time of the killings, and he's a fascinating character. He's also he's a frustrating character, and I'll explain why. So what we do know about him is he's 28 at the time of the killings. He comes from a good family. His father's a school superintendent. He has a brother who's serving on submarines in the Royal Navy. Gordon himself is well educated. He went to a technical school and graduated from there. And then after he leaves school and he starts bouncing around the workplace, you start seeing kind of this flaw in his character. He's not a very honest person. He steals from work. He's a womanizer. He's a ruthless womanizer. Flirts with everyone, sleeps with everyone he can. He actually loses one job because of his womanizing ways and flirting with the female staff at work. And so he definitely has a love for the ladies. And in 1936, he meets a theater secretary named Marjorie, who he marries. And she has no idea sort of what kind of character she's marrying. And even though he's married, he still carries on his womanizing ways. He's called up into the service in 1941. He joins the Royal Air Force and he trains to be a pilot. And this really fits in with his ego. Like you said, he's a very egotistical person. He loves the sort of the power that comes from wearing the uniform. He loves the attention the uniform gives him. Obviously, the ladies like the RAF uniform. So when he hits the city pubs at night and they're fawning over him, he loves it. He does inflate his background, like you said. In fact, and sort of to the detriment of his relationships with like sort of the other guys in his barracks. And he's stationed in a barracks in Regent's Park in London. And they start calling him the Duke because he talks with a very affected English accent. He starts talking with a very sort of posh, kind of like Downton Abbey type accent. And, he says he's descended from a duke and he's from this rich family. And none of it's true, but he just uses this to sort of, impress people, particularly women. And he uses this to his advantage. Women find him very charming. He's incredibly handsome, which is why, sort of some of these women who he approaches feel comfortable taking him, to their apartment at night. But what's frustrating about him is, despite his womanizing ways, he has a history of theft and stealing. He's gotten in trouble at various places for that. There's nothing violent in his history. And so the sort of the killings that occur kind of they come out from nowhere. And one of the complaints I actually received from readers, I should say, full transparency, after the book came out was, I got a lot of emails from readers going, "You never told us why he did this." And it's like, we don't know why he did it. No one knows why he did what he did. This is one of the frustrating mysteries about the Blackout Ripper. We don't have, there's nothing in his history. It took his family by surprise. It took his wife by surprise. But yeah, very charming, very egotistical, sort of kind of almost like a Ted Bundy type, really, if you think about it. He sort of like fits into that template.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Just, a lot of serial killers we know now, based on, serial killer psychology, is there's usually some sort of ramp up period where they kind of commit their first crime. It's kind of clunky. Right. They figure out their MO. He sort of just dives headfirst into it. He dives headfirst into it.
It's interesting, though, you mentioned like sort of, the clunky first crime or whatnot, because although we've got these 4 killings on record, which are sort of quote unquote, canon killings, official killings of the Blackout Ripper, there are several crimes around this time which were not solved, which he may have been responsible for. One of them was prior to the string of serial murders that the book focuses on. A girl was found strangled in a bomb-damaged building. The person who strangled her was left-handed. The Blackout Ripper was also left-handed. So they think that maybe she might have been an early victim. When I wrote the book, I actually didn't know about that case. I found out about it after. I was like, shit. I missed one. I missed one. And then a case I just mentioned in the book is at one point he's stationed in, I believe it's Wiltshire, and there is an attack on a woman in a town in Wiltshire near where he's stationed, where an airman stepped out of the shadows one night and started strangling this woman, but she escaped, but they never were able to identify who her assailant was. And they think that now maybe that was him.
Oh, interesting. So there does seem to be potential that there was some sort of escalation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk about, February 8th, 1942, he's posted to the RAF unit based in London's Regent Park. And again, you kind of talked about Evelyn Hamilton, his first victim. Now, my understanding is that he heads out into the town. He tells his wife at the time that he's going to the West End for a night.
That's terrible. He actually visits his wife beforehand, and he says to her, he goes, "Hey, I'm kind of hard up on cash. Can you give me some money?" And she gives him money to go out, and then he hits up the town and. Ends up killing someone. Yeah, and she's oblivious to it. But yeah, so on February 8th, he's got leave that night, and so the first thing he does is he goes visits his wife, asks her for a loan, she gives him money, and then he goes to the West End. We're talking about Soho here, so if you're familiar with London, Piccadilly Circus, Oxford Street, that kind of area, Marble Arch, bustling nightlife, a lot of bars, a lot of clubs. A lot of working ladies, ply their trade apply their trade there. It's very popular with military personnel. And he goes there and, he gets drunk and, he's hanging out with some friends. At some point, he separates from the crowd he's with. And we don't know how or where, but at some point, he crosses paths with the first victim, Evelyn Hamilton, who police later determine is probably returning home from dinner. They determine this because when they do the autopsy, she has food in her stomach, including beets. And so from that, they actually start canvassing the restaurants in the area, finding out which restaurants served beets that night. And they find a place called, I think it's called Lion's Corner House, which was a big multi-story restaurant on Oxford Street. It's now a department store. But they find a waiter who said, "Oh yeah, that woman ate there," and they managed to pinpoint the time. So they think that he probably crossed paths with her while she was walking home. She wasn't a prostitute, so how she ended up in the air raid shelter, he probably dragged her in there. Her shoes showed signs of scraping and scuff marks on there. He didn't, unlike the other victims, he didn't sexually assault her. He strangled her with a stocking. And when police find her, she was actually found the next morning on February 9th. She's found by two electricians who are going to work. They see a blackout lantern sitting on the air raid shelter, and they go and look in the shelter, and they find poor Evelyn Hamilton lying there. She does have her skirt bunched up around her, but she hasn't been assaulted. She has a stocking tied around her neck. She's got a scarf over her face. The killer has taken her two gloves and placed them on her chest, palms up with the fingers pointing towards her face, which is police don't explain why they did this, but it's sort of some weird. It does come across as some like weird ritualistic thing. And he does at other crime scenes kind of arrange things a certain way. She has money's been taken from her handbag. They later determined, so they think the motive might be theft, but they're not sure. But there's nothing obviously in that first killing to suggest what's about to happen.
Yeah, as you say, he really ramps up with the second victim, Evelyn Oatley, and she's found less than a mile from her flat, again in Soho. Talk about how he's really, again, ramped up and took it to the next level.
Yeah, so with Evelyn Oatley, this is where you really start seeing the Ripper aspects of the crimes come into play. So Evelyn Oatley, she goes out. She's seen at a pub like 10 o'clock at night having pints, and then she comes home. I think it's shortly before midnight or just after midnight, whatever. She comes home. She's seen a neighbor sees her coming up the stairs with a man. He's got a trench coat on. He's got the collar turned. It's very noirish, He's got the collar turned up, hiding his face. And the living arrangement for Evelyn Oatley is unique. Her apartment is actually one apartment split into two by a series of folding doors. And so on one side of the folding doors is Evelyn. On the other side of the folding doors is her neighbor. I think that her name was Cecilia. And Cecilia is friends with Evelyn. She's used to Evelyn bringing men home. What Evelyn would do was she'd come home. She'd go into her side of the folding doors. She'd turn on the radio, the BBC late night broadcast. She'd play it loud. So the noise of what was happening on the other side of the door, Cecilia couldn't hear it. So on this night, night of February 9th, she brings home a gentleman, goes behind her folding door. She turns up the radio. The radio's turned up louder than normal, Cecilia notices, but she doesn't think anything of it. And it plays a lot longer than normal, which kind of gets on Cecilia's nerves, but she doesn't say anything about it. And then, a couple of hours later, the radio goes silent. She hears footsteps descending down the stairs, the door to the street open and close, and then, whoever it is disappears into the night. On the morning of the 10th, meter readers come to the building to read the meters. Another aspect sort of life this time, a lot of these apartments, if you wanted to turn the lights on, you had to stick a coin in a meter and then turn the meter, and that would turn the lights on in your apartment. And then sort of the electric company, the meter men would come, empty the coins out of the meter, and go on the way. So the meter men show up that morning to read the meters and collect on them. And this is like shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. They go in to Evelyn Oatley's apartment, and the blackout curtains are drawn, but they see Evelyn. She's lying diagonally across the bed. Her head's kind of hanging over the edge of the bed. Her throat's been slit. Sort of a very deep gash across the throat, and blood has sort of dripped from the artery down onto the floor, and it's created like a river across the floor. And someone asked me once, how do you know these details? Like, how do you know blood formed a river across the floor? When you read the case files, the Scotland Yard case files, they are very descriptive. It's almost like reading a detective novel in themselves. It makes for fascinating reading. They go into sort of everything. And it can make for a very gory reading. But she's on the bed. There's blood pooling across the floor. Her throat's been gashed. She's been sort of stabbed in the genital areas with what looks like a tin opener. There's a bloody tin opener between her legs. She's also been violated with a flashlight. So this is a big ramp up from where she. From what happened to Evelyn Hamilton. And the reason for this, it's speculated, is because whereas Evelyn Hamilton was killed out in the open in an air raid shelter where someone theoretically could walk in off the street and stumble across what was happening, here in Evelyn Oatley's apartment, he has the place to himself. He's got the radio concealing the noise, and he can do what he wants. And by the sound, by judging from how long the radio was playing, he was in there for a long time, so he really had time to kind of sort of do his thing. But it is an incredible escalation from sort of the murder the night before.
Thanks for listening to this week's mystery. If you like what we're doing here, please consider leaving a review, giving us a 5-star rating, and sharing with a friend. It helps us independent podcasts get noticed. We'll be back next week with the second half of my interview with Simon Reed. So until then, thanks for listening to From the Void.